So today I'm going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, dead people. Well, it's some people's favorite topic anyway. Mortuary archaeology is a really important part of archaeology. It's basically the study of graves or of cemeteries or just the remains from funerals and other ways of taking care of the dead. It's sort of distinct from what would be called bioarchaeology. Bioarchaeologists are generally more interested in the actual skeletal remains of dead people. As the name would imply, they kind of study that to understand the biology of those people, whether that mean their diet or their health or maybe where they grew up, which you can sometimes tell from isotope analysis. Mortuary archaeology is a really cool part of archaeology for some people. It invokes like studying the mummies of Egypt. I would like to say though, for people who aren't as familiar with archaeology who might be watching, mortuary archaeology is not something you should take for granted. Dead people are really emotionally powerful for people who are still alive, especially if communities feel a close attachment to them, and there are a lot of ethical issues to think about to do with mortuary archaeology, and you should always think twice about excavating a grave. Now, the areas that I'm used to working with or thinking about, or that I have worked in, like the ones mostly Britain and Ireland, it is common practice to excavate, especially medieval and earlier graves, recent ones sometimes as well. So their mortuary archaeology does figure largely in the study of archaeology generally. Other places, though, that is not always the case, and we should always keep that in mind. Mortuary archaeology is one of those things that you'll get people really interested in because they'll think about, the treasures in Tutankhamun's tomb or big burial necropolis in Rome, things that are just really outlandish and wonderful. But mortuary archaeology is really interesting because even when it's more banal, it tells us a lot about life. Funerals and other rituals that we use to care for the dead, and caring for the dead is a really big part of people's emotional lives if you think about it. They tell us a lot about who we are. They're in a sense a performance, and I don't mean that in the sense of a performance like a play that you go to for entertainment, but a performance in the sense of a way that people convey meaning to one another. And so when you're caring for the dead, a lot of what goes into funerals actually reinforces for people who the dead were and who the people burying or otherwise caring for the dead are. It's a way for people to produce and reproduce the identities and values of a community and of kin groups especially. As you've heard a lot by now, I'm most familiar with the early medieval period. So when I think about Celtic burial practices, or at least burial practices in these places we think of as Celtic at this time, I think above all about Christianity. A lot of people think of the Celts as one of the barbarian peoples of Europe, one of the uncivilized people, so in consequence they must be considered pagans. And before Christianity became dominant in Europe, there definitely was paganism, or at least some non-Christian religion in these parts of Western Europe. If you look at like the old Irish myths, that's pretty readily apparent. But places like Ireland and Britain were actually converted quite early in the history of Christianity. And if you think about it, think about St. Patrick's Day, which we just had, Christianity remains quite important to this day in the places we think of as Celtic, like Ireland. The Protestant religions more in Wales and Scotland. Catholicism is also really important in Britain as well. There are some very elaborate rituals that become kind of characteristic of the Breton people, like the Compel. I'm presuming most people will be more or less familiar with Christian burial practices who are watching, but the basics of it is that it's going to be a burial, an actual burial, as opposed to a cremation, so it's called an inhumation grave. Cremation has gotten kind of more popular in recent times, but back in the day, back in the early medieval period, cremation was kind of a no-no for Christians. It had to do with beliefs about the sanctity of the body in the Christian religion. So you're going to be placing a body into the grave, and the grave is going to be dug so that it's oriented east-west. The head of the person is going to be facing to the west, and the limbs are going to be facing towards the east. The body, when it's in the grave, is also going to be what's called supine. That means they're lying with their face up. And the body is also going to be extended, so they're kind of laying out with their limbs kind of down at their sides and their legs extended. There are sometimes what are called crouched burials, where their limbs are kind of drawn up towards their chest, sort of in a fetal position, but that's not as common. It's actually quite rare in a lot of places, at least the ones I'm talking about. You generally also won't find a lot of stuff in Christian burials. There are some people, like Vikings, that furnished their burials with a lot of grave goods. You'll find things like cooking implements and other tools and swords in the graves. Christians didn't really do that. You might find coffins in a lot of places, but coffins are generally made of wood, and so they don't really preserve. But also you'll find graves that are lined with different stones. That's not really a prerequisite, though, for it being a Christian burial. That's kind of the 2-cent tour, though, of what Christian burial actually is. There's a lot more variation than people tend to give it credit for, because they'll just look at it and go, oh, there aren't really grave goods oriented east-west, it must be Christian. That's kind of the end of the story. But there are lots of different little things that people did. There's a lot more variations, and that's kind of what I've been doing part of my research on. Lately I've been looking at how mortuary ritual changed in early medieval Ireland, especially following the conversion of the island to Christianity. Now, there was a time when people thought that Patrick showed up in Ireland, kind of just went through this sudden epiphany of religion and everything changed all at once. There was this wholesale shift in burial practice. That isn't really true, though. People realized that there were burials that looked like Christian ones from before Christianity actually arrived. And then the other wrench that's happened lately is that a lot of excavations that are ongoing have kind of found this whole suite of site types that people didn't know existed before. They usually get called settlement cemeteries or secular cemeteries. They're not very good names. What they are is cemeteries where there isn't a church. So people thought that if you're a Christian, you were always going to be getting buried in a church, but they found there are these settlement cemeteries that have been in use for hundreds and hundreds of years past when Christianity would have been firmly established in Ireland. So burial ritual wasn't what people once thought it was. There is another aspect, though, that people have been fairly certain of, and that was that when people were getting buried in ecclesiastical cemeteries, the ecclesiastical cemeteries were away from earlier burial grounds. Early medieval churches and cemeteries were kind of a package deal, so the idea was that when people were building cemeteries and the churches that went with them, when they were Christian, they were specifically building them away from places that pagans had been getting buried from earlier. This kind of goes along with documents that we have, say that being buried among pagans is kind of dangerous to your soul. They don't entirely condemn it, but it's a pretty strong suggestion in them, and excavations have shown generally that there aren't burials that predate the churches in these medieval church sites, so people thought this made a lot of sense, and I'm going to say in general that's probably is what happened. But the research that I've been doing is trying to look at the evidence that maybe this wasn't always the case. There are a few places where it does seem, to me at least, that there were burials happening earlier than the churches were established, and quite possibly there were actually pagan burials at the places where some churches were founded. The thing that I've been finding looking at the burial evidence more is that people tend to talk about Christian burial or just these places like Ireland as if they're all sort of one unit, as if they're all going to be the same. They're really not. There's a lot more going on in these places than just their being Irish or just their being Christian. I've been looking at places like Owen Bristey and Kiltulla, which are sort of in Western Ireland, and what I find looking at this evidence is that you can't really explain what happened at Owen Bristey without thinking about, say, politics, or you can't think about what happened at Kiltulla without thinking about the landscape in the area. The moral that I've taken away from my research is kind of the same one that I was saying at the beginning about funerals and things not just being about death. They're also not just about religion. They're not just about really any one thing. There's a lot of things going on in these places that we really don't think about and that people don't give them credit for, and sometimes that's just a symptom of what we have to deal with. Archaeology is not a very complete record of evidence, but there's so much subtlety that we can sort of begin to draw out if we try to look for it. Now, that's kind of what I want to leave you with for this week, and it's something I want you to think about for next week as well, because I think next week is probably going to be my last post. I'm drawing to the end of my term here, so we'll see you then.